The wind was a wolf at the cabin door, howling across the desolate landscape like a hungry spirit. Inside, Sarah felt the cold seep into her bones, a deeper chill than mere temperature. It was the cold of absolute solitude, of abrupt abandonment. The small, crude structure, little more than stacked logs chinked with mud, offered scant protection against the biting wind and the heavier, unseen weight of despair that pressed down on her. Just days ago, the man who had brought her here, promised her a life, had simply vanished, taken the horses, their meager supplies that were easily portable, and left her with a few sacks of flour, a sputtering oil lamp, and the vast, unforgiving wilderness stretching in every direction. Sarah pulled the worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, the rough wool scratching against the delicate lace collar of her once crisp bodice. She was Prudence Sarah Atherton, formerly of Boston, a lady of refined upbringing, a schoolteacher of literature and deportment. Now, she was merely a woman alone, stranded at the edge of the known world, with a name that felt impossibly fragile in this harsh reality. Her hands, accustomed to holding chalk or turning the pages of Emerson and Longfellow, were chapped and trembling. The fear was a constant, nauseating tremor in her stomach. She had never been alone like this, never been without the reassuring structure of society, the predictable rhythms of civilized life, the implicit safety net of laws and neighbors. Here, there was only the wind, the endless gray sky, and the unnerving silence when the wind momentarily lulled, a silence that felt pregnant with unseen dangers. She had no idea how to hunt, how to trap, how to survive the rapidly approaching winter. The snow had already begun to fall in thin, persistent flurries, dusting the sparse pines outside and blurring the edges of the world. Each flake seemed to mock her helplessness. She had been foolish, so terribly, naively foolish, to trust him, to believe his grand promises of a life built anew in the West. He had painted a picture of a burgeoning town, opportunity, a place where her skills would be valued. Instead, he had brought her to this isolated cabin, miles from anywhere, and left her to whatever fate the wilderness decided. Shame burned hot beneath her fear, shame at her gullibility, shame at her desperate longing for a future she had convinced herself he offered. Her resources were pathetically thin, a small amount of firewood, dwindling rapidly. The flour, a few cans of preserved goods she didn't recognize. A single, small rifle he had left behind, unloaded, and she had no idea how to use it, nor did she possess any ammunition. He had taken even that essential. It was a clear message, wasn't it? He hadn't intended for her to survive. The thought was a bitter pill to swallow, hardening something fragile inside her just slightly. She wouldn't make it easy for the wilderness, or whatever wild creatures roamed out there. She wouldn't simply lie down and die. She forced herself to her feet, her knees shaky. She had to think. What were her options? None. There were no roads, no trails she knew how to follow, no settlements she knew the direction of. The nearest town he had spoken of was days, perhaps weeks, of hard travel away, assuming one had a horse, supplies, and the knowledge of the land. She had none of those things. Her only hope was that anyone might pass by. But the cabin was remote, hidden deep in the trees, clearly not on any regular route. She was marooned. The cold wind slipped through the chinks in the logs, chilling her already frozen feet. She needed more firewood. The thought was daunting, a physical effort that felt overwhelming in her state of fear and weakness. But the alternative was freezing. With a sigh that felt too large for her chest, she found the small, dull axe he had left leaning by the door. It was heavy, unwieldy in her hands. She stepped outside, the biting air stealing her breath. The world was a symphony of gray and white and the mournful cry of the wind. She looked towards the trees, the dark, silent sentinels that seemed to watch her with indifference. She had to start somewhere, even if it was just one small log, one step towards survival. Days bled into a week, then more. The flour dwindled. The preserved food was gone. Sarah had managed to chop a pitiful amount of wood, her hands blistering and sore, her muscles aching with unfamiliar strain. She was constantly hungry, a dull ache that gnawed at her stomach. The fear had settled into a low, persistent hum beneath her skin, ever present. She rationed the food fiercely, eating only tiny portions of the flour mixed with melted snow, a thin, watery gruel that did little to stave off the hunger. She learned to start the fire, painstakingly, with the few matches she had, guarding them as if they were jewels. She learned to listen to the sounds of the cabin, the creaks and groans of the wood, the rustling of small creatures outside. Every unfamiliar sound sent a jolt of terror through her. She hadn't seen a soul, not a single human trace in the vast, empty landscape. Despair would wash over her in waves, leaving her feeling weak and wanting to simply curl up and cease to exist. But then the stubborn spark, the flicker of determination, would reignite. She thought of the women in the books she had taught, the ones who faced adversity with courage and resilience. They were fictional, yes, but their spirit felt real. She would not let herself be broken. Not yet. It was late one afternoon, the light fading into the perpetual gray of the short winter day, when she heard it. Not the wind, not the creak of the cabin. A different sound. A rhythmic crunching in the snow outside. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. She froze, listening, every nerve ending screaming. The sound grew louder, closer. Heavy footsteps. Human footsteps. She scrambled back from the small window, her hands trembling violently. Who could it be? Hope warred with terror. A rescuer? Or someone dangerous? In this lawless land, she knew the latter was perhaps more likely. She backed further into the cabin, her eyes darting around, searching for a place to hide, a weapon, anything. There was nothing, only the empty cabin, her fragile self, and the heavy footfalls approaching the door. A shadow fell across the single window pane. Then, a heavy, decisive knock. Sarah stood rooted to the spot, unable to breathe, unable to move. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Hello?" A voice called out, deep and rough, muffled by the thick wood of the door. "Anyone in there?" It was a man's voice, unfamiliar. She didn't respond, couldn't. "I saw smoke from the chimney," the voice continued, impatience creeping in. "Open the door. It's freezing out here." Fear was a cold knot in her belly. Open the door to a stranger in the middle of nowhere. Every instinct screamed danger. But the thought of ignoring him, of him perhaps leaving and her losing her only chance. It was a gamble, a terrifying gamble. Slowly, her limbs stiff and unresponsive, she moved towards the door. Her hand hovered over the latch, fingers shaking so badly she fumbled with it. Finally, with a click, she released it. She took a deep breath and pulled the heavy door inward just a crack, peering out from the narrow opening. He stood on the small porch, a large man bundled in layers of worn, animal hides and rough cloth. A heavy fur hat was pulled low over his forehead, shadowing his eyes. A thick, gray-streaked beard covered most of his face, leaving only his nose and eyes visible. He smelled of wood smoke, animal fur, and the biting cold. His expression was unreadable, weary perhaps, but his gaze was sharp and assessing as it swept over her, taking in her pale, drawn face, her unsuitable clothing, the fear in her eyes. He carried a rifle slung over one shoulder, and his hands, thick and calloused, rested on the butt of the weapon. He wasn't what she expected. Not a gentleman traveler, clearly. He looked like the wilderness itself had forged him, rough, powerful, and potentially dangerous. "You're alone," he stated, his voice low and gravelly. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, unable to find her voice. He didn't move, his eyes still fixed on her. The silence stretched, filled only by the relentless wind. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a small, fragile bird before a predator. "How long have you been here?" he asked finally. She swallowed, finding her voice, came out raspy and weak. "Several days. More than a week." He seemed to digest this, his gaze unwavering. "Man leave you?" Another nod. The shame tightened its grip. He sighed, a heavy sound. He looked past her into the dim cabin. Ain't got much in there, do you? No, she whispered. He took everything. He was silent again for a long moment. Sarah waited, her heart pounding, unsure what he would do. Would he help her? Or was he the wolf she had feared? Can't stay out here, he said finally, pushing the door open wider with a firm hand. He stepped past her into the cabin, bringing with him the scent of the wild. He took off his fur hat, revealing a shock of dark, gray-streaked hair. His face was lined, weathered, his eyes a piercing blue that seemed to hold the vastness of the sky and the secrets of the forests. He was older than she had initially thought, perhaps in his late 40s or early 50s. He glanced around the sparse cabin, his gaze missing nothing. He saw the meager pile of wood, the empty shelves, the single cup and plate by the cold hearth. Fire's low, he observed. I only have a few matches left, Sarah admitted, her voice still trembling. He grunted, a low sound of assessment. He walked over to the hearth, knelt, and with swift, expert movements, coaxed the dying embers back to life, adding small pieces of kindling from her pile. The fire sputtered, then caught, casting flickering light and a little warmth into the cabin. He didn't ask her permission. He simply acted with a competence that was both unnerving and, she admitted reluctantly, reassuring. He stood up, dusting his hands. Name's Jedediah, he paused, waiting. Sarah, she managed, finding her voice again. Prudence Sarah Atherton. The full name sounded ridiculous, pretentious, in this setting. Jedediah didn't react to the Prim name. Jedediah Stone, he looked at her, his blue eyes direct. You got no food, no wood, no way outta here. Winter's coming hard. She nodded again, the stark truth of his words echoing her own desperate realization. My place is about a day's travel from here, he said, his voice flat, offering no emotion. Small trapper's cabin. Warm. Got supplies. Not a palace. He paused, and she sensed the unspoken question. Was he offering her refuge? Or was this a proposition? The air crackled with uncertainty. His eyes held a depth she couldn't decipher. There was no hint of kindness, but also no overt threat. Only a simple statement of fact, followed by this veiled offer. You would take me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked away towards the window, considering. Can't leave you here to die, he said, almost to himself. Ain't right, he turned back to her, his gaze firm. But it's a rough life. No comforts. You ain't used to it. I understand, she said quickly, perhaps too quickly. Anything was better than this slow, freezing starvation. I can learn. He seemed skeptical, his eyes lingering on her delicate features, her slight frame. It ain't easy learnin', he said, especially when the snow gets deep. He rubbed his bearded chin. Got to leave tomorrow morning. Daybreak. Gotta get you there before the worst hits. She nodded, a wave of exhausted relief washing over her, quickly followed by a fresh surge of anxiety. Going with a complete stranger, a rough trapper, into the deep wilderness. It was terrifying, but staying was certain death. I'll be ready, she said, her voice gaining a fragile strength. Jedediah grunted, a sound that might have been approval or simply acknowledgement. All right then. He looked around the cabin again. Got any food left at all? A little flour, she admitted, gesturing to the small cloth sack. That's all. He walked over, picked up the sack, and weighed it in his hand. Not enough for a mouse, he muttered. He went back to the door, opened it, and stepped outside for a moment. She heard him rummaging in his pack. He returned with a piece of dried meat and a small, hard biscuit. Eat this, he said, handing them to her. We'll need to travel light. Can't spare much. Sarah took the food, her hands trembling. The smell of the dried meat was strange, wild, but her hunger was a ravenous beast. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He didn't reply, just watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. He then moved to the pile of wood she had gathered. This ain't enough for the night, he stated. Stay inside. Keep the fire going. I'll get some more. He picked up her dull axe and his own, much larger, sharper one leaning by the door. But it's getting dark, she stammered, the thought of him going out into the twilight wilderness unnerving. Dark don't bother me, he said, pulling his hat back down. Freezing does. Need enough wood to last till morning, and with that, he stepped back out into the fading light, the door closing behind him, leaving her alone again, but this time with a flicker of hope, and the knowledge that the wilderness had, for now, sent her a reluctant protector. The next morning they left before dawn. The cold was brutal, slicing through Sarah's inadequate clothes. Jedediah had given her a heavy, slightly too large deerskin coat from his supplies, which helped but wasn't enough. She still wore her city shoes, now wrapped clumsily in strips of cloth she had found. Her breath plumed in the frigid air as she stumbled through the light snow, trying to keep pace with his long, steady strides. He carried his rifle, a large pack on his back, and moved with an effortless grace that spoke of years spent navigating this terrain. They walked in silence for the first few hours. Jedediah didn't offer conversation, his focus seemingly fixed on the trail, reading the subtle signs of the wilderness. Sarah was grateful for the silence. It allowed her to concentrate on putting one foot in front of the other, conserving her energy, and trying to quell the persistent fear that gnawed at her. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every snap of a twig sounded like an approaching predator. She watched Jedediah's back, his broad shoulders, the confident way he moved, and tried to draw some sense of security from his presence. As the sun finally rose, a pale, weak disk in the gray sky, Jedediah stopped. He pointed ahead with his rifle. "See that notch in the ridge?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah squinted, following his gaze. Far in the distance, she could just make out a slight dip in the tree-covered ridge. "My cabin's just beyond that," he said. "Another 6, 7 hours, maybe more depending on the snow." 6 or 7 hours felt like an eternity to her already aching body. She nodded, trying to project a resilience she didn't feel. He seemed to sense her weariness. "We'll stop for a bit when we find a sheltered spot," he said. "Got some jerky. Keep you going." They continued on. Jedediah moved with an almost animalistic awareness of their surroundings. He paused often, scanning the trees, the ground, listening. He pointed out tracks in the snow. Rabbit? Fox? Something larger she couldn't identify but which sent a fresh shiver down her spine. He taught her silently, not with words, but by example, by pointing, by his quiet vigilance. He was part of this landscape, intimately connected to it in a way she could barely comprehend. Midday, he led her to a small, rocky overhang that offered protection from the wind. He built a small fire quickly and efficiently using flint and steel. The fire felt like a miracle, its warmth seeping into her frozen limbs. He shared his jerky, tough, salty strips of dried meat that required effort to chew but filled her with a much-needed surge of energy. They ate in silence. Sarah watched him as he tended the fire, his movements economical and skilled. His face, weathered and scarred, was a map of a hard life. He seemed entirely self-sufficient, a man who asked for nothing and relied only on his own abilities. He was the antithesis of the men she had known in Boston, polished, articulate, but often lacking substance beneath the veneer. Jedediah had no veneer. What you saw was what you got, a man shaped by the unforgiving demands of the wild. You've been out here a long time?" she ventured, breaking the silence. He looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. "Most of my life," he said simply. "Since I was a boy." You prefer it?" she asked. He shrugged. "It's the life I know." He paused, his gaze drifting to the endless trees. "Less complicated than folks, mostly." His words were spare, but they hinted at a past, perhaps one that had driven him to seek solitude in the wilderness. She didn't pry. Curiosity warred with her ingrained politeness, and in this setting, his silence felt like a boundary not to be crossed. He finished his jerky and stood up. "Sun's moving," he said. "Gotta get moving." They resumed their journey. The snow deepened as they climbed in elevation. Sarah's legs ached. Her lungs burned with the cold air, and her feet were numb despite the cloth wrapping. There were moments she felt she couldn't take another step, that she would simply collapse in the snow and wait for the end. But then she would look at Jedediah's steady back, the relentless forward momentum, and find a flicker of strength she didn't know she possessed. She wouldn't be a burden. She wouldn't fail. Not if she could help it. Jedediah occasionally looked back, assessing her progress. He never offered a hand or a word of encouragement, but his presence was a silent pressure, urging her on. It wasn't cruel. It was simply the way of this world. You kept going or you didn't. As dusk began to fall, staining the snow with hues of purple and gray, Jedediah stopped again. He pointed ahead, and this time she saw it, a faint curl of smoke against the twilight sky. "Cabins just through those trees," he said. "Almost there." Relief, so profound it almost brought her to her knees, flooded through her. They had made it. She had made it. The cabin was smaller and even more rustic than the one she had been abandoned in, but it was solid, well-chinked, and sat sheltered in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. Jedediah pushed open the door, and the smell of wood smoke and drying herbs enveloped her, a scent of warmth and habitation. Inside it was simple. A hearth with a fire already banked, a rough-hewn table and chairs, a cot covered with furs in one corner, shelves lined with jars and supplies. It was Spartan, but it was a sanctuary. "Make yourself at home," Jedediah said, his voice losing some of its trail-hardened edge now that they were indoors. It wasn't exactly welcoming, but it wasn't unwelcoming either. It was just a statement of fact. Sarah sank onto one of the chairs by the hearth, letting the fire's warmth soak into her. Her body throbbed with exhaustion. She watched as Jedediah methodically went about his evening routine, taking off his outer layers, checking the fire, sorting through some traps he had brought in. He moved with the same quiet efficiency she had observed on the trail. He didn't offer her anything to eat immediately, and she was too exhausted to ask. She simply sat by the fire, letting the warmth chase away the chill that had become her constant companion. She felt a strange mixture of gratitude and apprehension. She was safe for now, but she was in a remote cabin with a man she barely knew, a man who was clearly capable and lived by his own rules. Her future here was uncertain, dependent on his willingness to shelter her, and her own ability to adapt. Later, Jedediah prepared a simple meal of stew from a pot hanging over the fire. It smelled rich and savory, unlike anything she had eaten in weeks. He scooped a portion into a wooden bowl and handed it to her. "Eat slow," he advised. "Your stomach ain't used to much." Sarah ate slowly, savoring each mouthful. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. The warmth of the stew spread through her, a comforting balm. Jedediah ate his own portion in silence, his eyes often scanning the small cabin, or staring into the fire. When they were finished, he cleaned the bowls and banked the fire for the night. "That cot's yours," he said, indicating the fur-covered bed. "I'll take the floor by the fire." "No, please," Sarah protested weakly. "I can take the floor. It's your cabin." He shook his head. "You need rest. Long day. Floor's fine for me." His tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. Sarah felt a surge of unexpected emotion. It was a small act of consideration, but after the abandonment, the fear, the sheer struggle to survive, it felt enormous. "Thank you, Jedediah," she said softly. He grunted again, not meeting her eyes. "Get some sleep. We got work tomorrow." Work? The word hung in the air. What kind of work could she possibly do? She was a schoolteacher, not a trapper's helper. But she didn't ask. She knew she had to prove her worth, earn her keep. She couldn't be a burden. She lay down on the cot. The furs were soft and warm, a luxury she hadn't experienced in what felt like a lifetime. Jedediah settled himself on the floor by the fire, wrapped in a blanket. Soon, his breathing became slow and even. Sarah lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the cabin, the crackle of the fire, Jedediah's quiet breathing. She was safe. She was warm. She was fed. The fear hadn't vanished entirely, but it had receded, replaced by a fragile hope and a profound uncertainty about the future. She looked over at the sleeping figure by the fire, a man of the wilderness who had, unexpectedly, become her lifeline. Who was he? What would he expect of her? She didn't know, but for the first time in weeks, she felt the possibility of survival, a chance to face the winter not alone, but with this quiet, capable stranger. Sleep finally claimed her, a deep, exhausted slumber. The days that followed settled into a routine dictated by the rhythms of the wilderness and Jedediah's work. Sarah quickly learned that his offer of shelter came with the implicit expectation that she would contribute. Her hands, once used to delicate tasks, began to toughen as she helped with chores, hauling water from the frozen stream, chopping kindling for the fire, preparing the meager meals, sweeping the dirt floor, and tending to the traps when Jedediah was out on his longer rounds. He was a demanding but not cruel teacher. He showed her how to do things with minimal instruction, expecting her to observe and learn quickly. If she made a mistake, he would correct her, sometimes with a curt word, but more often with a simple, wordless demonstration of the right way. He had a patience that surprised her, not the gentle patience of a teacher, but the enduring patience of someone who understands that learning takes time and effort. She watched him work, fascinated. He knew the forest intimately, the signs of animal trails, the best places to set traps, how to read the weather in the sky and the wind. He was a skilled craftsman, repairing equipment, curing hides, carving tools from wood. His hands, rough and scarred, were capable of both strength and surprising dexterity. He rarely spoke unless it was necessary, his communication often consisting of gestures, grunts, or sharp, brief instructions. Sarah, in turn, learned to interpret his silence, to anticipate his needs, to recognize the subtle shifts in his mood. She saw that beneath the rough exterior was a deep respect for the natural world and a quiet integrity. He never lied. He never wasted anything. He lived in harmony, albeit a hard harmony, with his surroundings. One afternoon, while Jedediah was out, a severe storm blew in unexpectedly. The wind howled like a legion of demons, rattling the cabin logs and threatening to tear the roof off. Snow fell thick and fast, reducing visibility to mere feet. Sarah was terrified. The small cabin felt fragile, exposed to the raw power of nature. She piled more wood on the fire, seeking comfort in its warmth, but the wind seemed to penetrate everything. When Jedediah finally returned hours later, covered in snow and ice, she rushed to the door, relief flooding her. He shook off the snow, his face grim. "Bad one," he muttered, stamping his feet. He worked quickly, securing the cabin, adding extra chinking to places where the wind was whistling through. He moved with an urgency that was unnerving. "Any leaks?" he asked, his voice sharp. "No, I don't think so," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. He nodded, his gaze meeting hers for a moment. In his eyes, she saw a shared understanding of the danger, a silent acknowledgement of their reliance on this small shelter. It was the first time she felt a sense of true partnership, however rudimentary, between them. As the storm raged outside, they sat by the fire. The silence was different this time, not awkward or fearful, but companionable. Sarah found herself telling him about her life in Boston, about her students, about the books she loved. She spoke hesitant at first, unsure how he would react to these fragments of a world so alien to his. He listened, not interrupting, his eyes fixed on the flames. When she finished, there was a long silence. She feared she had bored him, or worse, that he found her past life frivolous. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "Sounds like a different planet," he said. "It was," she admitted. "Very different." "Why'd you come out here?" he asked, his gaze still on the fire. She hesitated, the shame rising again. I thought I was coming to a new town, to build a school." He promised. She trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of her foolishness and the pain of the betrayal. Jedediah didn't press. He seemed to understand. "Folks out here," Some ain't honest, he said. See an opportunity. Take it. His simple words acknowledged her situation without judgment. It was a kindness she hadn't expected. He left you with nothing, Jedediah added, stating the harsh fact. Yes, she confirmed, her voice quiet. He was silent again for a moment. Well, he said finally, looking at her, you ain't nothing. You learned how to keep the fire going. You fetch water. You ain't useless. It wasn't a compliment, not in the way she was used to, but it was praise of the highest order in Jedediah's economy of words. It meant she was contributing, that she had worth here in this world. A warmth spread through her chest, stronger than the fire. Thank you, Jedediah, she said, her voice thick. He grunted, looking away again, uncomfortable with the expression of emotion. The storm outside continued its fury, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. The shared danger, the conversation about her past, his quiet validation of her efforts. It had chipped away a layer of formality and fear between them. They were two people, isolated by the storm and the wilderness, relying on each other. As the weeks turned into months, the deep cold of winter settled upon them. The snow lay thick and heavy, transforming the landscape into a silent, white world. Their lives became even more confined to the cabin and its immediate surroundings. Sarah learned the intricacies of preparing animal hides, stretching them, scraping them clean, a task that was messy and physically demanding. She learned to mend clothes and gear, her needlework skills from her former life proving unexpectedly useful. She learned to cook simple but nourishing meals with the limited ingredients they had: stews, bread baked in the coals, roasted meat. Jedediah spent his days checking his trap lines, a dangerous and arduous task in the deep snow. He would return in the late afternoon, often exhausted, sometimes empty-handed. His moods were tied to the success of his trapping, their primary source of food and income. When the catch was poor, the cabin felt smaller, tighter, filled with unspoken tension. Sarah learned to read the signs. The way he moved, the set of his jaw, the look in his eyes. She learned to be quiet when he was weary or frustrated, to anticipate his needs, to offer a warm meal and a dry place by the fire without fuss or unnecessary questions. Their communication became even more distilled, relying on shared glances, small gestures, the rhythm of their movements around the confined space. The formal prudent Sarah had long since been shed. He called her Sarah, simply, and she called him Jedediah. The titles of their former lives held no meaning here. They were just Sarah and Jedediah, facing the winter together. She still felt the fear sometimes, especially when Jedediah was out, the cabin silent and vulnerable. The wilderness still felt vast and threatening. But the constant, debilitating terror had lessened. She had found a quiet strength within herself, a resilience she never knew she possessed. She could build the fire even when the wood was damp. She could mend a torn coat. She could gut a rabbit, turning away the first time, but forcing herself to do it the next, recognizing the necessity. Jedediah observed her transformation without comment. But sometimes, she would catch him watching her, his blue eyes assessing. She no longer felt judged, but simply seen, acknowledged for her efforts and her progress. There was a subtle shift in his demeanor towards her, a softening perhaps, a quiet respect that was more valuable than any spoken praise. One evening, he returned with a severe gash on his leg, sustained while checking a trap. It was deep and bleeding profusely. Sarah, despite her initial shock and revulsion at the sight of the wound, reacted quickly. She remembered reading about basic medical care in one of her old books. She heated water, cleaned the wound as best she could with the limited supplies they had, and bandaged it tightly with clean strips of cloth. Jedediah, who usually seemed impervious to pain, grit his teeth through the cleaning process. He watched her as she worked, her face pale but determined, her hands steady despite a slight tremor. "You got good hands," he said, his voice strained. "I used to mend my students' clothes," she replied, focusing on the task. He didn't say anything more until she had finished. "Never thought a schoolteacher." Knew how to do that, he admitted, his voice low. There's much I didn't know I could do, Sarah said, looking at the rough bandage covering his leg. Before this. His gaze held hers for a moment, a look of understanding passing between them. The shared vulnerability of the situation, her unexpected capability, his reliance on her help, it deepened the unspoken bond between them. He was laid up for several days, the leg wound making it difficult for him to walk far. This meant the trap lines went unchecked, and their food supply grew even more precarious. Sarah took on more responsibility, venturing further from the cabin than she had before to gather wood, her fear of the wilderness warring with the urgent need. She still didn't know how to use the rifle, the one he had left behind. It sat in the corner, a symbol of a capability she lacked. She had asked Jedediah to teach her, but he had always put it off, saying it wasn't necessary for her. One day, while she was chopping wood near the edge of the clearing, she heard a sound that froze her blood, the low growl of a large animal. She spun around, axe raised uselessly. Standing at the tree line, watching her with predatory eyes, was a wolf, larger than any she had seen in pictures, its fur thick and gray. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The axe felt impossibly light. She backed away slowly, keeping her eyes on the animal, remembering Jedediah's quiet warnings about predators when alone. The wolf took a step forward, a low growl rumbling in its chest. Panic flared, hot and suffocating. She was alone, unprotected, vulnerable. Then, from the cabin, she heard a shout. Jedediah, limping heavily, stood in the doorway, the rifle in his hands. The sight of him, despite his injury, sent a surge of relief through her. The wolf turned its attention to him, its growl intensifying. "Get inside, Sarah," Jedediah roared, raising the rifle. Sarah didn't hesitate. She scrambled back towards the cabin, her legs pumping, her eyes still fixed on the terrifying standoff at the edge of the clearing. Just as she reached the porch, she heard the deafening crack of the rifle shot. She flinched, instinctively covering her head. When she looked up, Jedediah was lowering the rifle, his face pale from the exertion and the pain in his leg. The wolf was gone. She ran to him, her fear momentarily forgotten in her concern for his injured leg. "Jedediah, are you all right?" He nodded, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "Got him," he said, his voice rough. "Close call." He hadn't just scared it off. He had faced it, injured as he was, to protect her. The realization of his actions, the quiet courage he displayed, struck her deeply. He wasn't just a rough trapper. He was a protector, a man who would put himself in danger for another. That evening, after tending to his leg again, Sarah sat by the fire watching him. The near-death experience had shaken her, but it had also clarified something. Her fear of him, the initial apprehension about his rough nature, had been replaced by a profound gratitude and respect. "You saved my life, Jedediah," she said softly, breaking the silence. He looked at her, his blue eyes steady. "That's what folks do," he said simply. "Not always," she replied, thinking of the man who had abandoned her. He didn't respond, his gaze returning to the fire. "Jedediah," she said, her voice gaining strength, "teach me to use the rifle." He looked at her, surprised. "Thought you didn't like guns." "I don't," she admitted. "But I need to learn. I can't be helpless." "Not anymore," she met his gaze directly, her resolve firm. "I won't be a burden." He studied her face for a long moment, seeing not the prim schoolteacher who had arrived months ago, but the woman who had faced fear, learned to survive, and found strength in the face of adversity. He saw the determination in her eyes. He finally nodded. "All right, Sarah," he said. "Tomorrow. We'll start tomorrow." The next day, despite his limp, Jedediah began teaching her to shoot. He was a patient, thorough instructor, showing her how to clean the rifle, load it, aim, and fire. Her shoulder ached from the recoil, and the noise was deafening, but she persevered, focusing on his instructions. She learned quickly, her initial awkwardness giving way to a growing confidence. holding the heavy rifle, feeling its power, was a tangible representation of her changing self. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was becoming an active participant in her own survival. As winter slowly began to release its grip, the days grew longer, the snow began to melt in patches, and the first tentative signs of spring appeared. Life in the cabin remained hard, but there was a sense of having weathered the worst, of having survived together. The bond between Sarah and Jedediah had deepened into something unspoken, solid. It wasn't a romantic love, not in the conventional sense, but a profound connection forged in shared hardship and mutual respect. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable and their most capable. They relied on each other, not out of weakness, but out of a quiet understanding of the strength found in partnership. Sarah was no longer the same woman who had arrived, terrified and helpless. The wilderness had stripped away the layers of artifice and societal expectation, revealing a core of resilience and determination she hadn't known existed. Her hands were calloused, her face weathered by the wind and sun, her spirit tempered like steel. She could hunt small game, set snares, navigate the nearby woods. She was capable. Jedediah, too, seemed different. The perpetual solitude he had sought had been broken, and in its place, a quiet companionship had grown. He still preferred his silence, but there was a subtle warmth in his interactions with Sarah, a protective watchfulness that was always present. He had opened his solitary world to her, and in doing so, had found a connection he hadn't sought but seemed to value. One afternoon, as the snow was rapidly melting and the stream rushed louder with the thaw, Jedediah returned to the cabin looking troubled. "What is it?" Sarah asked, sensing his unease. "Tracks," he said, his voice grim. "Fresh tracks. Folks passing through." In the wilderness, unexpected human presence was often a cause for concern. Trappers were solitary by nature, and strangers could mean trouble, claim jumpers, thieves, or worse. "Who are they?" Sarah asked, her hand instinctively going towards the rifle leaning by the door. "Don't know," Jedediah said. "But they ain't just passing." They were circling back towards the cabin. His blue eyes were hard, vigilant. "And there's more than one." A knot of fear tightened in Sarah's stomach, a familiar sensation, but this time tempered with a new resolve. She was no longer the helpless woman who hid in the corner. She knew how to use the rifle. She knew how to fight. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady. "Wait," Jedediah said. "See what they want." He checked his rifle, loading it with quiet precision. "Stay back from the window." They waited. The cabin, which had felt like a sanctuary all winter, now felt exposed, vulnerable. The silence stretched, tense and heavy. Sarah stood beside Jedediah, the rifle in her hands, her eyes fixed on the door. Then they heard it, voices outside, rough and low. Footsteps approaching the cabin. Heavy, deliberate steps. "Jedediah!" A voice called out, loud and challenging. "We know you're in there. Come out." Jedediah didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the door. Sarah held her breath, the rifle feeling heavy and reassuring in her grip. "We know you got furs in there, Stone," another voice yelled. "And we hear you got a woman now. Brought a little piece of civilization out here." The voice was mocking, cruel. Sarah's blood ran cold. They knew she was here. Her presence had made Jedediah a target. Shame and anger surged through her. "We just want what's ours," the first voice shouted. "The land, the traps, the furs, and maybe the woman too." That did it. Any lingering fear was replaced by a cold fury. They saw her as property, as something to be taken. Not anymore. Jedediah exchanged a quick glance with Sarah. There was no need for words. They understood each other. "You boys got lost," Jedediah called back, his voice calm, steady. "Ain't nothing here for you." A harsh laugh from outside. "We'll see about that. We're coming in." They heard movement, the sound of someone approaching the door. "Sarah," Jedediah said, his voice low and serious. "Remember what I taught you?" "Yes, Jedediah," she replied. her grip tightening on the rifle. The door began to rattle as someone tried to force it open. Wood groaned and splintered. Jedediah raised his rifle, aiming at the door. Sarah raised hers, aiming slightly differently, remembering his instructions on covering different angles. "Last chance," Jedediah shouted. The response was another shove against the door, harder this time. Jedediah fired. The blast was deafening in the confined space. A yelp of pain came from outside, followed by cursing. Sarah fired too, aiming at where she judged a second man would be standing. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but she held her ground. Another shout of surprise and pain. Silence. Tense, waiting silence. "They're down," Jedediah said, his voice flat. "Or they're waitin'." They remained by the door, rifles trained, listening. The wind was rising again, carrying faint sounds from the wood's movement, whispers. More than two. "They're not alone," Sarah stated, her voice quiet but firm. Jedediah nodded. Figured. They were outnumbered. The cabin was solid, but it wouldn't hold forever against determined men. They needed a plan. "There's a small window in the back," Sarah said, remembering her time sweeping the floor. "Just big enough to get through." Jedediah looked at her, his eyes assessing. "Can you move quiet?" "I can try," she said. "Get out the back," he instructed. "Circle around through the trees. Don't make a sound. If you can get to the horses." "Horses?" Sarah asked, surprised. She hadn't seen any. "Got 'em tied up in that small ravine behind the cabin," he said quickly. "Hidden. If you can get to ride for the settlement." "No," Sarah said, shaking her head. "I won't leave you." "Sarah, you gotta," Jedediah insisted, his voice urgent. "This ain't your fight." "Yes, it is," she said, meeting his gaze, her resolve absolute. "They came for what's here. For you. For me. I'm not running." He stared at her for a long moment, seeing the woman she had become. The fear was still there. She knew, but it was overshadowed by her determination. A faint, almost imperceptible look of pride touched his eyes. "All right," he said, his voice low. "Then we fight together." He quickly outlined a plan. Use the cabin's defensible position, conserve ammunition, and try to pick them off as they approached. It was a dangerous plan, relying on their aim and the element of surprise. The siege began. The remaining attackers tried to flush them out, shouting threats, trying to set fire to the cabin walls, which Jedediah quickly extinguished, and occasionally taking potshots at the windows. Sarah, surprisingly, was a good shot. The practice she had done, the muscle memory Jedediah had instilled, paid off. She aimed carefully, waiting for clear targets, conserving her shots. The Prim schoolteacher who had fainted at the sight of blood now aimed a rifle with steady hands, defending her home and the man who had saved her. Jedediah fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, his knowledge of the cabin and the surrounding terrain giving them an advantage. He moved from window to window, anticipating their moves, his shots precise and deadly. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity. The air inside the cabin grew thick with smoke and tension. The sounds of the fight, rifle shots, shouts, the thud of bodies were brutal and terrifying. Finally, after a tense period of silence outside, Jedediah moved cautiously to a window, peering out. "They're gone," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Pulled back. Took their wounded." Sarah lowered her rifle, her hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. She felt physically ill, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her weak and shaky. She had faced the wolves in the wilderness and the wolves in human form, and she had survived. She looked at Jedediah, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, his injured leg clearly paining him. He looked back at her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and something akin to awe. "You did good, Sarah," he said, his voice quiet. "Real good." It was more than praise. It was an acknowledgement of her transformation, her resilience, her strength. She had not just survived. She had fought, and she had won. They spent the rest of the day securing the cabin, tending to Jedediah's wound, which had worsened, and assessing the damage. The cabin had held, their supplies were intact, and they had faced the threat together. As evening fell, they sat by the fire, the silence between them different than it had ever been. It was a silence filled with the weight of what they had endured, and the quiet strength of their bond. "They won't come back," Jedediah said finally. "Not after that. Word gets around." Sarah nodded. She believed him. They had proven they were not easy prey. She looked at the fire, at the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. This cabin, this harsh wilderness, had become her home. This rough-and-tumble trapper, her unexpected protector and partner, had become her anchor. She had come to the West seeking a new life, promised a future that turned out to be a lie. But in the face of abandonment and despair, she had found something truer, something deeper. She had found her own resilience, her own courage, and an unlikely connection with a man of the wilderness who saw her not as a fragile lady from the East, but as a strong, capable woman who could face down wolves, both animal and human. The fear would likely never completely leave her, but it no longer controlled her. She had faced her deepest vulnerabilities and emerged stronger. The prim schoolteacher was gone, replaced by a woman forged in the crucible of the wild, standing tall beside the man who had shown her the way. The future was still uncertain, the wilderness still vast and challenging, but she faced it now with quiet dignity, inner strength, and the silent partnership of Jedediah Stone. They had survived the winter, the abandonment, and the attackers. Whatever came next, they would face it together.